Further, while the skull bone does not itself feel, it seems that perhaps a more specific significance could still be found for it in the fact that specific feelings, through their proximity to the skull, might enable us to ascertain what it is that the skull means to convey. And when a conscious mode of spirit has its feeling in a specific area of the skull, the shape of this part of the skull might perhaps indicate what that mode is and what is its special nature. Just as, for example, some people complain of feeling a painful tension somewhere in the head when they are thinking hard or even when thinking at all, so too could stealing, committing murder, writing poetry, and so on each be accompanied by its own feeling, which besides would necessarily be located in its own special place. This area of the brain which would in this way be more moved and activated would probably also develop the adjacent area of the skull bone. Or again, this particular area would, from sympathy or consensus, not be inert, but would enlarge or diminish itself or modify its shape in some way or other. What, however, makes this hypothesis improbable is this, that feeling as such is something indeterminate, and feeling in the head as the center might be a general sympathetic feeling accompanying all forms of suffering, so that mixed up with the thieves, murderers, poets, head itching or headache are other feelings which could as little be distinguished from one another and also from those we can call merely bodily feelings, as an illness can be diagnosed from the symptom of headache if we restrict its significance merely to the bodily aspect. In the course of the discussion during the previous paragraphs, Hegel was first criticizing physiognomy as a pseudoscience. Why is it a pseudoscience? It can't really yield us intelligibility and necessity like a genuine science is supposed to do. And then he turned to phrenology, and now we're knee-deep in the middle of that. He's already levied some pretty damning criticisms against the discipline or pseudoscience of phrenology, which focuses on the skull and on recesses or bumps or other features of the skull bone, which are supposed to signify something about the composition of the brain, which then is in turn supposed to signify something about the nature of the person whose brain it is. So here in paragraph 334, he's going to consider another possibility that the phrenologist might be bringing up. And he's going to show us why this doesn't really work. So the phrenologist can say, sure, the skull bone itself doesn't have any feeling, doesn't have any sensation. It is, to a certain respect, a dead thing, like you've been saying, Hegel. But we can still say that there would be particular feelings, and we should be very careful here about the terminology. Hegel says that the skull bone itself does not feel fühlen anything, right? But he doesn't say Gefühl for this. What's translated here as feeling. He says Empfindungen, which is a bit more broad, and you could translate that perhaps as sensations, right? And this works as well. So the skull itself doesn't, as skull, have sensations. You can say, well, but it hurts on my head when things happen. Well, that's the tissues surrounding the skull. It's not the skull itself. But we're not worried about feelings of pain or pleasure so much. We're interested more in other types of feelings, other types of sensations. And Hegel says, okay, so we're going to now consider this possibility. So perhaps a more specific significance could still be found in the fact that specific feelings, through their proximity to the skull, not in the skull, but to the skull, might enable us to ascertain what it is that the skull means to convey. Remember, what we're dealing here with is a discipline which says that the skull itself is in some way meaningful, significative, and not just in terms of like comparing skulls against each other or charting out human evolution or anything like that, nor for like forensic purposes. Oh, this skull is bashed in, or people put holes in it, something must have been going on there. Rather, we're looking at the skull as somehow meaningfully significative of the person whose skull it is. So allowing us to say something about who that person is, what kind of person that they are. So he goes on and he says, perhaps it could be that a conscious mode of spirit has its feeling in a specific area of the skull. So a conscious mode of spirit, that covers a wide range here. So we're talking about everything from love to being friendly, to being antagonistic, to having artistic preferences, to being a Philistine, to, we might go down the line to even, today talk about genres of music or likings for certain kinds of media materials. Maybe those would have their own particular correspondence in parts of the skull, because they have their own particular sensations. And it could get quite elaborate. There could be a number of different things being laid out. But this is the general idea, that the skull itself would be the locus, holding all this goopy stuff in our head in. But the brain is really where this is happening. And the brain parts would be corresponding to, like we said, specific modes of spirit, of mental activity, of Geist. So he goes on and he says, you could have a feeling in a specific area of the skull, and then the shape of this part of the skull might perhaps indicate what that mode is and what is its special nature. So we're back again to the skull being deformed in certain ways from its otherwise ordinary shape to, concluding that it's because something is going on with the brain inside of the skull. And we don't really understand the process. Hegel's already, made it kind of clear, but also in a joking way. I was going to say made kind of a joke before about, why would it push out the skull? Why not push in the skull? The skull is harder than the brain. Why doesn't the skull just constrain the brain? And we don't have an explanation for the mechanism of how this is supposed to happen. But the phrenologists are saying, well, look, we know that we have different mental faculties and different activities and different propensities. Those could, in some way, through the medium of the brain, be connected to regions of the skull and their particular determinations. So he says, let's take an example. Some people complain of feeling a painful tension somewhere in the head when they are thinking hard or even when thinking at all, right? This is true. Some people get headaches from thinking. Some people do feel a kind of tension when thinking is going on. We in fact do localize our psychical processes. It's not always in the head. Sometimes we say we feel things in the chest or in our guts, right? Or our hands clench because we're angry. It's not just that the body is flooding us with, adrenaline or anything like that. This is a psychical thing. The anger is represented in the hands. But we're talking about the head here. And we could say, all right, so some people do in fact get headaches when they have to think hard. What does that prove? What does that actually give us? First of all, it doesn't push their head out or anything like that, right? The way the phrenologists are hoping that it would do. Nor does it shrink the skull in on them, although we may have a sort of sensation like that when we feel very tense. But that's really in the tissues rather than in the skull and the brain. Now here's where Hegel goes with this. He says, okay, so let's accept that some people do in fact have a physical bodily manifestation of pain or tension when they're thinking hard. Then maybe there could also be things like characteristic behavior, stealing, committing murder, writing poetry, and so on. Maybe each of these would be accompanied by its own particular feeling, which then would be localized in part of the brain, and then would have to do with the skull by pushing it out or deforming it or making it rounder or flatter or something like that. Each would be localized in its own special place. So following out this logic, he says, this area of the brain, which would in this way be more moved and activated, would probably also develop the adjacent area of the skull bone. This is one of the fundamental conceptions of phrenology. murderers should have a certain feeling localized in the brain, which then does something to the skull bone. And so by looking at the skulls of people, you could tell what their characteristic behavior ought to be. Murderer. Other people, poetry writers. Notice Hegel doesn't say good poets or bad poets, right? I suppose anybody who self-identifies as a poet can fit the bill for this, or anybody who does write poetry, whether it's good poetry and captivates us or total drivel that we walk out of the coffee house saying, this is nonsense, I'm not listening to this stuff. That would have its own specific area of the brain with its own particular feeling, and that again would push on part of the skull or pull on part of the skull or affect it in some way. So you could look at somebody and say, aha, that person's going to be a poet. And presumably murderous poets would have both parts developed, right? And you can say, well, that guy's a poet, so on the one hand, if you like poetry, that's great. On the other hand, don't walk down the dark alley with him because he's a murderer. So, Hegel says this area of the brain, which would in this way be more moved and activated, would probably develop the adjacent area of the skull bone. Or again, this particular area would, from sympathy or consensus, not be inert, but would enlarge or diminish itself or modify its shape in some way or another. That's another possibility. So, you feel poetry in your veins, that part of your brain swells up and gets big. Or maybe contracts, or maybe moves around from side to side. We don't really know which. We're just sort of assuming until we do brain studies on this sort of thing. And brain studies are a little artificial, at least at this point in time, when we have to put people into MRI machines or hook them up to electrodes. We're not getting real spontaneous data, although we try to adjust for that. But now think back to Hegel's time, before we could crack people's heads open and actually see what was going on in there before they're dead, let alone put them inside of these massive machines to make images of what's going on, at least as far as the electrical activity in their brain. We're just sort of shooting ideas out there and saying, yeah, maybe part of the brain does this, corresponds to this activity, stealing, killing, writing poetry, being a great lover, being a terrible lover, being good with money, being bad with money, pursuing ambition, all these sorts of things. Does it really work? Hegel says no, and so here's his criticism. He says, what makes this hypothesis improbable, this is a hypothesis, but it's improbable, is this. Feeling as such is something indeterminate. And feeling in the head as the center might be a general sympathetic feeling accompanying all forms of suffering. So that mixed up with the thieves or murderers or poets, head itching or headache are other feelings which could as little be distinguished from one another and also from those we call merely bodily feelings, as illnesses can be diagnosed from the symptom of headache if we restrict its significance merely to the bodily aspect. So Hegel's saying, it's fine as a hypothesis. It fails when we try to apply it because it's just, too messy. There's so many things going on in the conscious modes of spirit of the person. Even if we take out bodily stuff, just completely bodily stuff, and we just attend to that, it's already quite complex. Now we add the body itself in. We can't be sure that any of this stuff localized in some part of our head really corresponds to what would be going on in that part of the brain. As a matter of fact, we know now that the brain itself doesn't have that sort of apparatus going on where it's pushing things out and pulling things in, unless there's, in a very gross way, like it's, somehow, there's something else going on with the person's body. So this is not going to work as a hypothesis, but Hegel's going to still continue to examine how phrenology might be able to justify itself, because he has to go through that. That's what it means to be critical. You can't just throw criticisms out there. You have to aim them right where the target is, and that's what he's doing in this case. In fact, from whatever side we look at the matter, there is no necessary reciprocal relation at all between them, nor any direct indication of such a relation. If all the same the relation is still to exist, what remains and is necessary to form it is an irrational, free, pre-established harmony of the corresponding determination of the two aspects. For one of the two aspects is to be a non-spiritual reality, a mere thing. On the one side, then, we have a multitude of inert areas of the skull. On the other, a multitude of mental properties whose number and character will depend on the state of psychology. The more paltry the conception of spirit, the easier becomes the task from this side. For partly the mental properties become fewer, and partly they become more detached, rigid, and ossified, and therefore more akin to the characteristics of the bone, and more comparable with them. But although the task is made much easier by the paltry conception of spirit, yet there still remains a very great deal to be done on both sides. There remains for observation the entire contingency of their relation. If the children of Israel, who are likened to number to the sands of the seashore, would each take unto himself the grain of sand which stood for him, the indifference and arbitrariness of such a procedure would be no more glaring than that which assigns to every faculty of soul, to every passion, and what must equally be considered here, to each nuance of character, which the more refined psychology and knowledge of human nature likes to talk about, its particular area of skull and shape of skull bone. The skull of a murderer has not this organ or even sign, but this bump. But this murderer has as well a multitude of other properties, just as he has other bumps, and along with the bumps also hollows. One has a choice of bumps and hollows. And again, his murderous disposition can be related to any bump or hollow, and this in turn to any mental property. For the murderer is neither merely this abstraction of a murderer, nor does he have only one bump and one hollow. The observations indulged in on this point must, just for that reason, sound as sensible as that of the dealer and of the housewife about rain at the annual fair and on wash day. Dealer and housewife might as well make the observation that it always rains when a particular neighbor goes by, or when they eat roast pork. Just as rain is indifferent to circumstances like these, so too from the standpoint of observation, a particular determinateness of spirit is indifferent to a particular formation of the skull. For of the two objects of this observation, one is a dry, sapless being for itself, an ossified property of spirit. The other is an equally sapless being in itself. Such an ossified thing as both are is completely indifferent to everything else. It is just as much a matter of indifference to the high bump whether a murderer is in its vicinity, as it is to the murderer whether flatness is close by him. Here in paragraph 335, Hegel is levying another major criticism against any pretension of phrenology, or anything like it, we ought to say, that's going on in our own time, to being in any sense truly scientific. And not just scientific in Hegel's broader sense of Wissenschaft, which includes more than what we call the natural sciences now, but even if we just concentrate on the natural sciences, merely tabulating things on people's heads and doing various correlations between parts of the brain that are being activated or not being activated is not enough to actually establish a science, nor is doing statistical modeling. There has to be an intelligibility, there has to be a real connection going on, or else what one is doing is really essentially a kind of intellectual play using physical means. And Hegel here is going to talk about the relation. He says, whatever side we look at the matter, there is no necessary reciprocal relation at all between them. What is the them? The brain parts, and correspondingly the mental properties that we'll talk about, and the parts of the skull, or the regions of the skull. There is no necessary reciprocal relationship between them. It doesn't matter which side we're actually looking at, we're not getting that. The phrenologist is assuming that as a hypothesis in order to get going, and then making up all sorts of really cool charts and coming up with examples of people, but it's not really a relation that has the character of a law. It doesn't have not just regularity, but a kind of necessity or intelligibility to it. Why is this connected with this? Why is this not connected with this over here? Hegel's going to get to that in just a moment. So he says, if all the same the relation is still to exist, let's say that there is a relation between them. Here's where a kind of irrationality creeps in. What remains and is necessary to form it is an irrational, not a rational, but an irrational, free, pre-established harmony of the corresponding determination of the two aspects. If there really is some sort of connection between the regions of the skull, what's observable, and the parts of the brain, which are to some degree observable, but much less so. We don't really know what we're looking at much of the time. There can be a connection, but it becomes a connection that doesn't have a why to it. And if it's lacking a why, there's a problem there. We don't want just the that. We want to understand why are these things connected in this way and not in that way. If we don't have that, we don't have genuine causality, we don't have any sort of true intelligibility. The relation becomes an irrational that we just simply have to accept, and we don't really know what to do with it. Other than perhaps manipulate it, push this part in and see if that changes the person or anything along those lines. There's a way of thinking about this. If we had to pick one term to sum up Hegel's critique here, it's arbitrariness, Willkürlichkeit, or Willkür in German, right? And if we want to be very clever, we could say what Hegel is saying here is that Wirklichkeit, actuality, the actuality of this presumed relation, let's say that it is actual, becomes Willkür. Wirklichkeit, willkürlich. We could play around with the W's there. We don't have to do that necessarily. We can say that, look, the problem here is that this relationship is truly arbitrary. How can we demonstrate that? Hegel goes on to do that. He says, on the one side, we have a multitude of inert areas on the skull. On the other, a multitude of mental properties, right? And these are sort of connected with the brain. And he says the number and character of these will depend on the state of psychology. So if we're focusing on this side over here, we have a discipline of psychology. And we've had this discipline around for a long time. By the way, psychology is originally part of philosophy. It goes all the way back to Plato and Aristotle, right? Aristotle's On the Soul. We call it the De Anima. It's, about the psyche, the soul, the object of psychology, right? So this investigation has been going on for a very long time. In the 19th century, we're going to see a great turn to, quantifying things and measuring things and doing experimental psychology. But that's already going quite well in the 18th century, and Hegel is following up on this sort of thing. Phrenology is coming out of this. What psychology we have is going to determine what mental properties we're actually looking for. Let me give you an example of how this might play itself out. So, some people think, and this is not only in psychology, but we can also call this the philosophy of action, that we simply have desires or feelings. We have affects, and we don't have any control over them. They drive us. And then thoughts that we happen to have about them are just, after the fact. They may be justifications. They may be ways for us to make sense of it, right? So that's a particular psychology. Who holds that sort of psychology? David Hume. I think Thomas Hobbes, in a certain way, holds that psychology. Many other people have as well. An older psychology that is rooted in virtue ethics says that we actually do have some measure of control over what we feel, because there's some sort of reciprocal relation between thinking, the thoughts that we have, and feeling. Doesn't mean that we can, dictate everything about it, but it does mean that we can gradually modify our desires to make them, say, more rational, or, if you want to put it in very basic terms, less likely to screw us up even more than we currently are. Now, those are two different psychologies, two different ways of understanding the psyches of human beings, and they may, in fact, have, as families of psychology, very different understandings of how the mental properties are interrelated with each other, which then ought to presumably be reflected if they have some sort of discussion of the brain about how the brain is, divided up into its functions, and then that in turn would have to go to different areas on the skull. So if you've got like Hegel says, if you've got a fairly underdeveloped psychology, he says, the more paltry the conception of spirit, the easier becomes the task from this side. What does he mean by a paltry conception of spirit? He doesn't just mean not having a lot of different functions. He means something like thinking, well, we're basically just machines. Or, everyone's just driven by self-interest, and that's pretty much the whole game. That's a very paltry conception of spirit. It doesn't even map onto our experience very well, right? People have to do a lot of self-talk in order to keep thinking those sorts of things. They have to keep watching the right videos to put them in the right frame of mind, and keep giving themselves pep talks about how the whole world is just a bunch of selfish people. Well, if you have that's going to be a fairly easy to work with thing. You're not going to need a hell of a lot of mental properties to explain things. But the bad side of that is you won't actually be explaining much of anything, will you? And that's going to be reflected in an easier job over here. He says, the more paltry the conception of spirit, the mental properties become fewer, and partly they become more detached, rigid, and ossified. Therefore, more akin to characteristics of the bone, much more comparable with them. People who want to do a sort of mechanistic, materialistic reduction, who love that sort of thing, see what their psychology looks like. It's often quite impoverished. It can't really take account of our experience, or at least the experience of those of us who don't constantly din this sort of thing into our ears. It becomes something more like just a bunch of parts together in the skull, or tissues, right? He goes on and he says, although the task is made much easier by this, there still remains a lot of work to be done on both sides. There remains for observation the entire contingency of their relation. That's the fundamental problem. The entire contingency of their relation. Why is this part of the brain connected with this part of the skull? There's an easy answer to that. Well, it's close to it in vicinity. Why is this mental property connected with this part of the brain and thereby connected with this part of the skull? No explanation. It just is that way. It fell out that way. That's what contingency quite literally means. It comes from the word to fall. You throw the dice, they fall down that way. There you go. No further explanation. That's deeply unsatisfying for any genuine psychology. Anyone who really wants to make sense out of things. So he goes on and he's got this great example of the children of Israel, right? He says, if the children of Israel, who are likened in number to the sands of the seashore, should each take unto himself the grain of sand which stood for him, the indifference and arbitrariness of such a procedure would be no more glaring than that which assigns to every faculty of soul, to every passion, and what must equally be considered here, every nuance of character which a more refined psychology and knowledge of human nature likes to talk about, its particular area of skull and shape of skull bone, because it assigns to it a particular part of the brain and thereby a particular part of the skull. The more complex, the more adequate to reality, to the lived reality of experience that our psychology gets, the more difficult the task of coordination gets to figure out where on all these parts of the skull this is going to map onto. Now he points out a further problem with this, right? So let's say you could actually do that. And let's say you didn't do it with parts of the skull. Let's say instead you did it with MRI scans. I mean, put aside the fact that it turns out that there's some inherent problems with the programs that were doing the MRI scans for over a decade. Let's say all that problem didn't exist. We're going to do MRI scans, and we're going to get over the problem of taking human beings and putting them inside of these essentially tanks, which are going to already affect the brain state of the person. And let's just imagine that we have a technology that allows us to do brain scanning in a very, very sophisticated way of people as they're walking around, doing their thing, going up to the podium and giving a presentation, making love, eating their meals, yelling at children in the street for crossing against traffic, all these sorts of things, right? Imagine that. That's a big leap right there. I don't know when such technology will ever exist. Probably not in my lifetime, but just imagine it. Now, would that actually reveal to us, any more than the phrenology with its parts of the skull, the true nature of the human person and all of the mental properties, all of the passions, all of the particular experiences? We like to think that it does. But does it? Do we really have solid, not just evidence, but a reasoning, an account to make sense of that? There's a problem of what we call overdetermination. When we see an event happening, and let's get away from the brain. When we see an event happening, there's multiple ways to understand that event. That's why, thinkers like Thomas Aquinas would say it's very important to attend to how you describe an action. Because an action can be described in multiple ways. Is that man stealing the loaf of bread? Or is that man taking something in order to feed his family? Maybe both. Maybe neither. Maybe one more than the other. Maybe one of these is more adequate. Well, we have to be similarly careful when we talk about what's going on in the brain. There's an electrical impulse happening and there's certain neurons connected together. Well, that could be anger in that person, or that could be excitement, or that could be a memory of a time when they were embarrassed, or that could, and we can go on and on and on. You see how that happens. Similarly with the skull stuff, and this is much more crude, back in Hegel's time, he says, let's take the skulls of murderers, right? The skull of a murderer has not this organ or even sign, but a bump somewhere. But this murderer also has a multitude of other properties, just as he has other bumps. And along with bumps, also hollows. One has a choice of bumps and hollows. And again, his murderous disposition can be related to any bump or hollow, and this in turn to any mental property. For the murderer is neither merely this abstraction of a murderer, nor does he have only one bump and hollow. Two ways to look at this. One is we can say, well, being a murderer is a much larger scale property than, say, having this particular mental property. Could be that there's certain mental properties that are tied in with being a murderer. I could think of several offhand. Anger management problems, right, would probably lend itself to being a murderer. Although there's no guarantee, right? I got anger management problems. I haven't killed anybody. Willing to bet that a good portion of the people watching this can say the same thing about themselves, right? And maybe a lack of regard for human life, egoism, any of these sorts of things. These are themselves, though, huge, huge complexes of mental properties as well. But let's say we get over that problem, right? If we can say that being a murderer is a matter of multiple things, then we've got to look for all those multiple things, and we have to see those reflected in the brain, and then we have to see those reflected in the skull in order to be able to say, well, this person's definitely a murderer. Even with, the crime itself, we say, well, they have to have, motive, opportunity, cause. Not motive and opportunity and means, sorry. Or, there's other ways to parse it as well. It's not quite so simple. Similarly, a person is a poet. Why? Because he's got this bump on his head or this recess in his head. I don't know. Have you ever tried writing poetry? It's not quite so simple as just, activating a certain part of your brain, right? There's a lot more involved in it than that. Certainly if you want to write good poetry, which I've only done a few times in my life, written plenty of bad poetry. So there's this problem of overdetermination. We also don't even know really where to look when it comes to the skull. Is it this bump or this bump or this bump? If we could do statistical correlations, and we say, well, if you've ever seen these 19th century monographs on the physiological criminal type, put aside all the racism that's involved in them right off the bat, and let's say we just focus on, skull shape or something like that. Is there really a correlation that we can make, a true relation, something like a law, between being a criminal type and then having a skull shaped in certain ways? No. And Hegel goes on and he says, here's the problem. The observations indulged in on this point must, just for that reason, sound as sensible as these people that we talked about earlier, the dealer and the housewife, who talk about rain at the annual fair and on wash day. The dealer, just to remind ourselves, says, oh yeah, whenever there's the annual fair day, it always rains on me. And the housewife then says, yeah, whenever I hang out my laundry to dry, it always rains on me too. Totally arbitrary. Totally willkür in Hegel's term. So he says, dealer and housewife might as well make the observation it always rains when a particular neighbor goes by, or when they eat roast pork. Rain is indifferent to circumstances like these. So too, from the standpoint of observation, a particular determinateness of spirit is indifferent to a particular formation of the skull. He says, one is a dry, sapless being for itself, an ossified property of spirit. The other is equally sapless being in itself. Such an ossified thing as both are completely indifferent to everything else. It's just as much a matter of indifference to the high bump, whether a murderer is in its vicinity, as it is to the murderer whether flatness is close by him. So what is Hegel saying here? Again, we've got this, if we want to boil it down in two terms, arbitrariness of the relation, overdetermination of any presumed relation between these. This is a pretty damning blow against phrenology. It's also revealing to us, it's not purely critical, it's revealing to us a little bit about how we ought to think about ourselves as spirit.